ever since I was a kid, I always wanted to be a park ranger. Maybe it was the idea of being a hero to some lost tourists or trapped cavers. Or maybe I just realized from a very early age that I wasn't cut out for work in an office. I needed to feel the sun on my back and the breeze in my hair, to look out over a great expanse of wilderness and not see a single trace of human civilization. Or so I thought back then. Hell, maybe I just thought the uniform looked cool. In the end, the reasons don't matter. As sure as water flowing downstream, I was set on the course that led me here, to the Arvell National Forest. That isn't the real name of this place, but it will have to do. What's important is that we're talking about nearly 2.5 million acres of land, bordered by nothing but dusty 2-lane roads and dying small towns. Tourists mostly come in just 3 times a year: spring break, midsummer, and a few weekends in October for the fall colors. During the rest of the year, the local economy depends on a trickle of vacationing families and rugged backpackers. They rent the kitschy log cabins, buy ice and beef jerky from the general store, eat at Molly's Greasy Spoon Diner on the park border. Occasionally, they get hurt or go missing, and that was where Leroy and I came in. This was my first position with the Park Service, whereas Leroy had been working in the Arvell National Forest for years. When we first met, at the cabin that would become my family's new home, the difference between the two of us was striking. Leroy wore his rugged khaki outfit like he'd been born in it, and he moved with the quiet confidence of a man whom life held no more surprises. I, on the other hand, had gotten turned around on the back roads, and arrived late even though I had left early. My wife Tracy had spent the drive looking skeptically out at the endless forest, while our 4-year-old daughter Emma was throwing a tantrum in the back seat because her bag of chips was the wrong color. By the time the little wooden cabin appeared around a bend in the gravel road, I felt tense enough to snap. Leroy didn't even turn around as we pulled up the gravel driveway. He stood on the small hill beside the cabin, watching the woods. If he noticed how nervous I was, he didn't seem to care. He just smoothed out his thick gray beard, shook my hand, and gave me the keys like he couldn't wait to be gone. Once Leroy saw my wife and daughter climbing out of the SUV, however, his attitude changed. He wanted to know what the hell they were doing here. He'd specifically requested that the ranger sent to this post be a single man without any family ties. When I gently reminded him that hiring requirements like those were discriminatory, he just snorted and waved us inside. Suddenly, Leroy wanted to stick around and give us a grand tour. The cabin had been built in the 70s, and it showed. The walls were yellow pine, the floors were covered in puke green carpet, and the brown linoleum in the kitchen was peeling. Leroy gestured around the place as if to say, "This is what you get when it's paid for by the government." What he really wanted to show us turned out to be a backup generator and the floodlights. The cabin had well water and a septic tank, but was hooked up to the grid for power. The problem was that ice, a windstorm, or even a fallen tree could knock it out for days. Leroy patiently explained how to set up the generator and use it to run the lights. They needed to be kept on all night, he insisted. No exceptions. I told him that sounded to me like a waste of money. He told me that I should learn to keep my mouth shut and do as I was told. If I gave him just one little reason, Leroy warned me, he would send me and my little family packing. With his tour finished, Leroy handed me a map of the park, a schedule, and a bag containing my work uniform. The rest of my issued equipment was waiting for me at the ranger station, 15 miles to the south. Leroy would see me there the next morning, if I survived the night, he smirked. I wasn't completely sure that he'd meant it as a joke. On his way out the door, Leroy stooped down in front of Emma and glared at her with his flinty gray-blue eyes. I moved protectively towards my daughter, but she didn't run to me like she usually did when strangers interacted with her. Instead, she waited patiently for whatever the old man had to say. "Hey, kid," Leroy began. Your daddy ever talk to you about how to stay safe in the woods? Emma nodded. What did he say? Stay where an adult can see you. Don't touch plants and animals you don't know. And if you get lost, sit down and scream. I was proud of my girl, but Leroy said nothing. Then, he added, and don't go outside after dark, right? Emma nodded again. Leroy ruffled her feathery blonde hair and walked out of the living room, letting the rusty screen door slam behind him. It was a hell of a welcome to my new job. And, as it turned out, it was just the beginning of what the Arvell National Forest had in store for me. Our SUV was stuffed to bursting, not only with everything we needed for the move, but also with groceries. The nearest real grocery store was almost an hour away, and Tracy had insisted that we stock up. By the time we'd finished unpacking, the sun had set. All we wanted was to eat some hot soup and crawl into bed. Only Emma had any energy left. While Tracy and I ate in exhausted silence, she swung her feet and sang along to a tune that, for all I knew, she had invented herself. I had just stretched and announced that it was time for bed, when she sprang out of her chair and gripped my hand. The lights! Emma shouted. I didn't know what she was talking about at first, until I remembered Leroy's commandments about keeping the house illuminated after dusk. Outside of the cabin windows, the night seemed as black as the bottom of the ocean. If I flicked the switch on now, what might I see? Pushing thoughts of pale, grinning faces and tall, spindly things with too many legs out of my mind, I did as my superior had asked. Suddenly, the small yard around the cabin was as bright as day. The forest branches were bone white in the blazing light. I thought I could even hear the electricity hum. Nothing moved outside. Not even a squirrel. What? I wondered again. What's the point of all this? To serve as a marker to anyone lost in the woods? To frighten away wild animals? Thieves? Or something else? I was too tired to care. Leroy had been right all along, I realized. What did it matter what the lights were for? I wasn't paying for them, and turning them on was, apparently, just another part of my job. After a final look out the window, I closed the blinds and went to bed. When I arrived at the ranger station the next morning, Leroy was having coffee with Betty Brock, a 50-something Native American woman who was sheriff of one of the dying counties that bordered the park. I recognized her from the "Re-elect Sheriff Betty" campaign signs that I'd seen everywhere on our drive in. I had to hand it to her. She was persistent. To get elected sheriff as a woman out here, I figured you had to be. This is Brett McCammon. He's going to be the new deputy ranger around these parts. Him and his family just moved in yesterday. There it was again. That weird emphasis on my wife and child. The sheriff and Leroy exchanged a dark look. But before I could ask what it was about, she offered me some of the donuts she'd brought. I turned her down, admitting I was trying to watch my carbs. Sheriff Betty just laughed, then told me I'd regret it. And she was right. Leroy put me through my paces that morning. I never imagined that a pot-bellied old man would be able to move so fast. While Sheriff Brock minded the comms at the ranger station, Leroy took me on a hike to the most critical trouble spots in the Arvell National Forest. The clifftop overlook where people kept falling while trying to take a selfie. The narrow ravine that always got hit with flash floods after a heavy rain. The sight that chilled me the most was a deceptively calm creek near a busy picnic area. It was connected to a series of cave systems, and beneath its smooth, dark surface, that water flowed fast and cold. Every year, a few families ignored the "danger, no swimming" signs. As a result, they never saw their children again. Leroy and I peeled off our boots and plunged our aching feet into the refreshingly cold water. Just as he'd said, the current was deeper and faster than expected. There's one other thing you should know, Leroy added. Rabies has been a problem out here for a while. The State University sends researchers every now and again. So far, whatever they're doing hasn't done jack shit to solve our problem. So if you see any of the wildlife acting strangely, just, keep your distance, okay? I thought back to what I taught Emma. Don't touch plants and animals you don't know. And a shiver went up my spine. At dusk, we drove back to the ranger station in Leroy's ancient, dusty truck. On the way, he told me that I'd kept up better than he'd expected. You just might be able to hack it out here after all, he said. I took it as a compliment. We were about to turn into the station when a massive black shape bolted across the road. Leroy threw on the brakes, cursing. We skidded to a halt in a cloud of burning rubber. The thing that had cut in front of us, however, was already gone. When I asked Leroy what it was, he said he thought it might be a bear. But that wasn't what it looked like to me. Its limbs had been too long. Its body too emaciated and stretched. It hadn't looked like any animal I'd ever seen. If it was a bear, I joked, it must have been a hungry one. Leroy didn't laugh. He kept drumming his fingers on his service weapon while we closed down the station and locked the gate. By the time I began my drive back to the cabin, his nervousness had infected me as well. The darkness beyond my headlights felt infinite. I kept expecting that thing to run out in front of my SUV as well. If it did and caused an accident, who could I call? There wasn't much cell service out here, and even if there was, what if the thing didn't die? What if it stuck its jaws through the shattered windshield of my car and started trying to feed that horrible hunger? I told myself to stop it. I was driving faster than usual, eager to get home and make sure that whatever that thing had been, it wasn't in the living room of the cabin feasting on my family. As I turned the corner of the gravel road, I was relieved to see that the floodlights were on. Tracy and Emma didn't understand why I was so upset. They'd had a great day decorating Emma's bedroom, exploring the yard around the house, and making homemade pizza for dinner. Maybe it was just first day jitters. Maybe that thing in the road really had just been a starving black bear. The thought didn't make me feel any safer. I could tell Tracy and Emma were concerned, so I did my best to put on a brave face, to laugh and joke around the dinner table like usual. Fake it till you make it, I told myself. And by the time we got around to doing the dishes, I felt like myself again. The place and situation might have changed, but we were still the same happy family we'd always been. All it took was a single phrase, spoken by my daughter as she looked out the rear window, to shatter that illusion. Daddy, there's a man with antlers in our backyard. I set down the plate in my hand and hurried to her side. The tree line, however, was just as barren as always. Had she seen a deer or something? I knew that kids often let their imaginations run away with them, especially in new environments. But after the day I'd had, it was the last thing I needed to hear. Are you sure, honey? I asked. Emma had already moved on to something else, making her Barbie fly through the air like Superman. She just looked up at me and shrugged. So much for the man with antlers, I thought. But even after an exhausting day and a hot shower, I struggled to fall asleep. In my dreams, I was being hunted down the now familiar trails of the Arvell National Forest by a bright-eyed black beast that looked like something out of a medieval painting of hell. Cartoonish, danger, no swimming signs glared down at me from the skeletal trees as I ran. I could see Sheriff Brock up ahead, standing with her back to me. When I spun her around to warn her about the beast, I saw that she had been dead for a while now. Her head hacked off and replaced by that of a deer. The rotting animal's bloated purple tongue wriggled. Maggots dribbled down its chin onto my boots. The sheriff's corpse held out a rectangular pink box. Hey, new guy. the deerhead said in a gravelly voice. "Want a donut?" I woke, drenched in a cold sweat. Tracy was snoring softly beside me. It was 4 a.m. Only 3 hours left until my shift started at the ranger station. Knowing full well that I wouldn't be able to get back to sleep, I tiptoed into the kitchen to make coffee and a bowl of oatmeal. I looked out the window at the floodlit woods while I ate. Of course there was nothing out there. What else had I expected? Leroy and I worked in turns, only seeing each other at the ranger station for a few hours at the beginning or end of a shift. We'd give a report on the day's incidents. There were usually none. Chat a bit about the weather, then go our separate ways. We also rotated who was on call overnight. Since I had a family to take care of, Leroy generously took 5 nights per week, while I only took 2. Not that any calls ever came in, but still, it was a relief knowing that I wouldn't be dragged out of bed because of some drunken college kids who had set their tent on fire. On my drive home that Friday evening, I caught a glimpse of a long, dark shape loping along by the side of the road. Despite being encased in the protective steel cage of my SUV, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Was this the thing we had almost crashed into on my first day? As I slowed down, I realized that it was no horror movie monster. It was a very large, very wet, stray dog. It watched me pass by with mournful golden eyes, as though hoping I might have a spare T-bone steak to toss out the window. I considered stopping, then remembered Leroy's warning about rabies, and changed my mind. Sorry, buddy, I thought as it disappeared from the rear view. Better luck next time. Maybe it was that unexpected encounter which gave me another bout of insomnia that night. It wasn't until the azure sky began getting brighter that I finally switched off the lights, disgusted, and sat down to doze in a saggy green armchair. Annoying, I thought. How those branches kept scratching against the window panes. I would need to trim them back this weekend. I sat up with a start. There were no trees that close to the cabin. I rushed to the wall and slammed on the floodlights. The yard was empty, but there were a pair of large, greasy handprints on the living room window. Even worse were the scratches above them. Just the sort that could have been made by a pair of antlers scraping against the glass, while something tried to open the latches. Vagrants? A prank? Something even more sinister? I washed off the filth before Tracy and Emma woke up, and decided not to mention what I'd found. I didn't want to scare my family before I knew what I was dealing with. But I did remind my wife where I kept my spare service weapon, and its ammunition. I was more concerned about Emma, who loved the woods and played near them every chance she got. It stormed all that weekend, but I can't say that I minded. It gave me an excuse to keep Emma inside. By Sunday afternoon, all of us were going stir-crazy inside the cabin. So we put on our rain gear and took a walk along the edge of the forest. I should have been relieved to get out of the house, but I couldn't relax. I kept imagining some horrible creature lurching out of the undergrowth to drag my child away. Emma, oblivious, splashed through the puddles in her knee-high rain boots. She had gotten a short distance ahead of me when she let out a shriek. Slipping in the muck and wet grass, I came running, only to discover that she was excited about having seen a salamander. The weather was an omen of things to come. The days were getting shorter, the nights cooler. The weather was damp and overcast. By the time the leaves began to change, I thought I had a handle on my role at the Arvell National Forest. Even Leroy seemed begrudgingly proud of me. On the last Friday in September, the weather was beautiful again, like a last gasp of summer, and Leroy dropped by the station to send me home early. "I'll take over," he said kindly. "Take the wife and kids for a spin around the park this weekend. Show them there's more to this place than just mud and rain." I drove home with the setting sun at my back. the wind in my hair, and the radio blaring. I was excited to share the good news with my family. Twirling the keys in my hand, I skipped up the driveway and snuck around to the cabin's backyard, where I was sure Emma would be playing. What I saw there stopped me in my tracks. Emma wasn't alone. Despite the twilight gloom, I could clearly see that she was playing with a large, dark-haired dog. I recognized those sad, golden eyes. It was the same animal I'd seen loping along the road. When I approached, it gave Emma's hand one final lick and bounded off into the woods. Tracy waved at me from the cabin window, where she was drying dishes. Furious, I barged inside. Tracy didn't understand why I was angry. The dog had been coming by for weeks now, she said, and it had taken to Emma right away. It didn't have a collar, but it wasn't mangy or sickly looking, and as far as aggression was concerned, she'd never heard it so much as bark. Emma didn't have any playmates out here, Tracy reminded me, and the company was doing her good. My wife put a hand on my shoulder. It was fine, she insisted. Emma was right here in the backyard, and from the kitchen she could keep an eye on her the whole time. I wasn't convinced, but I also didn't want to separate my daughter from her new friend. If I drove the dog away for no good reason, I was sure that Emma wouldn't understand. Besides, my wife was watching, and if she noticed any unusual behavior from the animal, she could get Emma to safety right away. Confident in my decision, I spread a map out across the rickety kitchen table and started planning our excursion through the park. We left the cabin Saturday morning at dawn, and didn't return until nightfall, worn out from all the walking and sunshine. The day had been just as perfect as Leroy had promised. I'd introduced Tracy and Emma to all my favorite spots, including some hidden ones that I doubted more than a handful of people could find. We'd splashed in creeks, scrambled up mossy rocks, and peered over the edges of waterfalls. And now, all three of us were ready for bed. While Tracy unloaded the SUV, I made straight for the cabin. The sun was setting earlier every day, and I scolded myself for not having been home to turn on the floodlights. As I turned the key in the lock, I heard a sort of snort. It seemed to come from right behind me, and was exactly the sort of huffing sound a deer might make. Almost as a reflex, I shoved open the door, stuck my hand inside, and slammed on the light switch. When I turned around, though, all I saw was Emma staring at me from the back seat. "You didn't look happy to see you, Daddy," Emma commented later that night, as I helped her change into her pajamas. "Who, honey?" I asked. "Man with the antlers." My blood ran cold, but I finished putting Emma to bed before rushing to talk with Tracy. My wife was curled up in the sagging green armchair, sipping tea with a blanket on her lap. Another sign of cold weather coming. When I asked her if she had seen anyone standing around the cabin, however, she just looked confused. Tracy had been struggling with a cooler full of melted ice, and hadn't even looked up until Emma and I were already inside. She wanted to know if anything was wrong. I told her that I wasn't sure. How could I explain what I'd been noticing lately, without sounding insane? Only one thing was clear. Whatever was happening in the Arval National Forest seemed to be targeting me and my family. And to make matters worse, it seemed to be escalating. What would I find next time? Emma's man with antlers standing over me as I slept? The floodlights apparently played a role in keeping whatever it was at bay. But I needed more information. It was time for me and Leroy to have a little chat. As it turned out, that was easier said than done. When I arrived at the ranger station the next Monday morning, I found Sheriff Betty Brock, not Leroy, waiting for me. She had come bearing bad news. The night before, emergency services had received a call from someone claiming to be a wounded hiker. The ranger station was nearest to the scene, and Leroy, the only one on duty that night, had sprung into action. When he hadn't checked back in by dawn, 2 deputies were sent down the trail he'd taken. They had found Leroy lying unconscious at the bottom of a ravine. It wasn't clear exactly what had happened, but it had rained overnight, and it was possible that he had slipped on the same slick, steep trail where the hiker had supposedly been injured. His head wound was severe, and the lower temperatures brought on by the rain put him at risk for hypothermia. Leroy was a tough old bastard, Sheriff Brock admitted, but he didn't exactly take care of himself, and the outlook wasn't good. He'd been taken to a hospital 2 hours away for treatment, but remained in a coma. Just a tragic accident? Maybe. But from there, things started to get strange. Less than an hour before Sheriff Brock's visit to the ranger station, a woman named Hannah Malik had come in about her missing son, Tyler. He and 2 of his friends had left for a backpacking trip on Friday, and she hadn't heard from him since. It worried her, especially considering that her son was constantly on his phone. When Sheriff Brock ran his information, she discovered that Tyler's number was the same one that made the emergency call the night before. When she replayed the call for his mother, however, her face went pale. The garbled, gravelly voice on the other end of the line sounded nothing like her son. Despite the bizarre circumstances, my training kicked in. Apparently, we had 3 missing teenagers on our hands. Before I could make any preparations, Sheriff Brock held up a hand. The boys were fine, she told me. They'd gotten home late that afternoon, not suffering from anything worse than a few scratches and a bad hangover. When she'd asked Tyler about the distress call, however, he'd had no idea what she was talking about. He had lost his phone on their first day out. I asked Sheriff Brock what she thought it all meant. She told me to pour myself a cup of coffee and sit down. This place wasn't always called the Arvell National Forest, Betty sighed. In the language of my people, it has a different name. An old and wicked name. A name that means red waters. In those days, we made our living as fur traders. Pelts were valuable, and the settlers wanted access to the territory where we trapped and hunted. They didn't dare to risk open war. There were too few of them and too many of us, and we knew the land too well. Then their leader, a man called James Arvell, proposed a trade. In exchange for a season's supply of furs, the children of our chieftains would be sent to a school downriver, where they could learn the settlers' ways. It was a trap. All who attended the meeting were killed hideously, even the infants. And the place where all that butchery happened, it's now a picnic area. You've heard how the creek is connected to a cave system, right? Our people say that the tribe learned of the massacre when they saw their family members' bloody, shattered bodies rising up from the stream. Red waters. Get it? Of course, all that's ancient history. What isn't is what happened next. The chief had brought his youngest children to the exchange, but left his 3 eldest behind. 2 boys and 1 girl. The 3 of them swore revenge at any cost. Legends say that they offered their soul to the spirit that dwelt in the caverns below, if only it would grant them the strength to bleed Arvell and his people until there was nothing left. There are some who believe that the spirit took the deal. The trio became immune to hunger and thirst, to exhaustion and cold, and to any mortal weapon. They say that they had the strength of wild beasts, that they could change their shape, see in darkness as though it were daylight, and appear and disappear at will. With such powers at their disposal, it wasn't long before their vengeance was complete. The settlers' records claim that James Arvell and his family were attacked by a pack of starving wolves and eaten alive. As you can imagine, in my people's tradition, the story is a little different, but the conclusion is the same. If it was wolves that killed the Arvells, They must have been strange animals indeed. See, they stripped the flesh from the Arvel's bones until there was nothing left, but kept their faces perfectly intact, staring up in terror at the winter sky. It was only afterwards that the siblings understood the awful price that they would pay for their victory. Even the people who they had avenged now shunned them, sickened by their powers, and by how they supposedly maintained them. There were rumors about secret rituals, about the consumption of human flesh. The trio came to hate the light. They withdrew to damp, dark places, where no human eyes could witness the extent of their gruesome transformation. There they wait, lonely and hateful as ghosts, until their hunger drives them back to the surface. Or so they say. Sheriff Brock downed what was left of her coffee, slammed her mug down on the desk, and looked disappointedly at the empty donut box beside it. She stood and strode over to the huge map of the park on the wall, running her fingers across its elevation lines as she spoke. If only there was some kind of pattern. If we just knew where or when they were going to strike, it would be different. We could close off sections of the park, shut down on certain days of the year. They're totally unpredictable. Almost as unpredictable, you might say, as a massacre. Of course, certain times and places see more activity than others. As you might have guessed, they avoid bright light. They only move around at dusk, after nightfall, or during truly bad weather. That's probably what saved Leroy. The clouds broke and the sun came up before they could finish the job. The creek, the cliff top, the ravine, those are the worst areas. How many of those supposedly missing kids do you think got dragged down by a cold hand beneath the water? How many of those hikers fell to their deaths while running from something inhuman? You probably took what Leroy told you about the accidents and disappearances at face value, didn't you? Didn't even bother to look up the statistics behind them, or notice how excessive they seemed to be. Sandra, your predecessor, wasn't like you. She was meticulous, a go-getter, a real white knight. She'd spent some time overseas in the military, and she thought that qualified her to handle our little problem once and for all. She said she had a theory about where the trio hibernated, and she wanted Leroy and I to go in with her, along with all the firepower we had. I'm a politician, not a soldier, and old Leroy has seen too much to imagine that they could be stopped. We turned her down, so she went in alone. Officially, your predecessor abandoned her post. Unofficially, Leroy found her body stretched between two trees on the cliff top. Just like with James Arvel, they'd stripped the meat from everything except her face. The pair of us gave her a decent burial. You'll have to forgive me if I don't tell you where. Sheriff Brock turned, scanning my face for a reaction. Thunder rumbled. I peeked out the window. It was too late in the season for a summer storm, but the dark, towering clouds on the horizon didn't appear to have gotten the memo. Does the legend say that one of those three siblings can transform into a deer? I asked carefully. The eldest brother. Betty nodded. They say he valued speed above all things. The youngest, who valued strength, could transform into a bear. And what about the sister? A bitter smile crept across the sheriff's face. She was more clever. She chose an animal that was both quick and strong, but that would also appear unthreatening to humans. They say that she could take on the form of a large, dark-haired dog. I was sprinting to my SUV before I even knew what I was doing. "Emma!" I shouted, not sure who I was addressing. The sheriff? The horrors in the forest? God? Under the circumstances, any of them would have made sense. I peeled out of the parking lot, startling a family of 4 who were packing away their picnic in anticipation of the storm. As sheets of iron-gray rain began falling from the sky, Betty Brock's words echoed in my ear. They only move around at dusk, after nightfall, or during truly bad weather. It was still mid-morning, but I figured this storm would still qualify. I wanted to be wrong. I just didn't think that I was. I called Tracy's number frantically as I drove, but the phone kept slipping in and out of service like always. Previously, the bad reception had been annoying. Now, it might be deadly. I was driving like a maniac, far too fast for those winding mountain roads, even if the conditions had been perfect. I skidded around corners in sloshing waves of water, the steering wheel loose and useless in my hands. But I didn't dare slow down. I checked my phone, hoping that one of my calls had gotten through. No such luck. A sound as loud as a freight train whistle jolted my attention back to the road. I had drifted into the opposite lane, and a logging truck was heading straight for me. I slammed the wheel hard to the right, fishtailing onto the shoulder, but managing to avoid a crushing death by a few inches. My knuckles were white on the wheel, my breathing ragged, but I aimed my tires back at the road and kept accelerating. Through the curtains of water, I could see red and blue lights behind me. Sheriff Brock. She wasn't here to pull me over, I realized. She had come to provide me with an escort, to make sure that I reached the cabin as quickly as possible. The rain was so heavy, though, that I doubted her flashing lights would make any difference. I had never seen such a storm. Branches swayed and cracked in the wind. The windows of the old general store, the only other structure between the ranger station and the cabin, had gone dark. That could only mean one thing. The power was out. Would Tracy know to turn on the floodlights even though it was still technically daylight? Would she remember how to use the gas-powered generator? Everything depended on the answer. As I turned up the gravel driveway, my fears were confirmed. Battered by the storm, the lightless cabin looked abandoned. There was no sign of any deer-headed monster or any ravenous bear-like thing, but that might have been because they were already inside. I ran to the cabin, leaving the engine running. A dark shape shifted on the other side of the screen door, almost like it was waiting for me. "Go on, I'll cover you," Sheriff Brock shouted out the window of her cruiser. She threw on a rain slicker and drew her sidearm. "What's wrong?" Tracy asked through the screen door. It was her, of course. She must have come to the door when she heard us coming. "There's no time to explain. Where's Emma?" I gasped. "She's in the kitchen, playing with Coco." "With who?" "Sorry, I know you said not to, but we gave the dog a name. We actually brought her inside. Coco's behaving great, and she just looks so wet and miserable out in the rain." I pushed my wife aside and ran to the kitchen. Or tried to. I was still unfamiliar with the cabin, and with no illumination, it felt like a different place entirely. Like something out of a nightmare. As I slipped on Emma's toys and crashed into the furniture, gunshots rang out behind me. Despite the danger ahead, instinct made me glance over my shoulder. The gaunt monstrosity lumbering toward Sheriff Brock looked less like a black bear and more like a child's nightmare drawing of one. Her bullet sank harmlessly into its matted, rain-drenched fur. A child's high-pitched shriek broke through my fear and reminded me why I was here. To protect Emma. "You're not my friend?" my daughter was screaming. "You're not a doggy at all." In the kitchen, a wild-haired figure rose from the floor. The gloomy light streaming through the window reflected in its golden eyes. And, on its sharp, horribly dog-like teeth, its fingers, multi-jointed and many times too long, stretched towards a knife on the countertop. And then everything became blindingly, unbearably bright. The generator rumbled. its noise briefly drowned out by an inhuman wail from the kitchen. The window shattered, as a twisted form, neither entirely human nor entirely canine, flung itself backwards through it. I looked to the living room, where my wife stood over the generator panting. For a brief second, I caught a flash of another figure standing behind her. A tall, muscular man with a deer's head. It held a tomahawk to her neck, nicking it just enough to draw blood. Then, it flickered and was gone. Tracy's hand flashed to her throat. It came away stained red. Did something bite me? She asked. I didn't know how to respond. Emma sat on the kitchen floor amidst broken glass, shaken but unharmed. The screen door swung open, making us all jump. A few more seconds and this place would have needed a new ranger. And a new sheriff. Betty Brock grumbled. What was that thing? Tracy wondered. A bear? I guess you could say that. I checked the gas reserves. Even if the power stayed out, we had enough to keep the generator running for a long while. I felt like laughing, like celebrating, but I soon learned the same harsh lesson that those 3 cursed siblings had so many years ago. Victory always comes with a price. When Sheriff Brock got back in touch with her deputies, she discovered that Leroy's condition had taken a turn for the worse. As the clouds began to clear, we all piled into my SUV and followed her cruiser to the hospital. Even then, even before we knew, the drive felt like a funeral procession. Sheriff Brock went straight to the front desk to ask about Leroy. But, as it turned out, I learned about his death before she did. A pair of orderlies passed by me in the hall, gossiping. Poor bastard, one was saying. He almost pulled through. And did you see the gashes in the back of his head? I mean, they almost looked like they were made by a tomahawk. I don't expect anyone to believe this story, especially after I've changed so many of the names and dates. But if by chance you rent a cabin or go camping in one of our lovely national forests, do yourself a favor and keep the lights on. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.